Hello, hello, wonderful to have you here. It's another beautiful day here in the countryside, and I want to discuss the difference between living in the city or the country. What kind of lifestyle is particularly beneficial or useful in Buddhist practice? What did the Buddha have to say about this? Did the Buddha have anything to say about this? In fact, he did. And what I want to do in today's video is to go over some of the Buddha's thinking about where we should be living to make our lives easiest when it comes to the Dharma. Now, to begin with, we have to keep in mind that in the Buddha's day, there wasn't anything like cities that we know today. What there were, we might say, villages, and there was the countryside or the wilderness. There wasn't really anything else. The largest towns would have been very small by today's standards. And monastics, people who were monks or nuns under the Buddha's tutelage, had a choice. They could live in a town or they could retreat into the countryside. Now, living in a town had distinct advantages. It was much easier to gain alms food in a town. We have to recall that the Buddha's instruction to his monastics was that they had to go out and beg for their meals. They had to beg for their food. They were not allowed to gather food for themselves nor to cook for themselves. They were forced by rule to be reliant upon the lay community for their alms, their food, their clothing, their lodging, their medicines, and all of these would have been much easier to obtain if they were already living in a village. Further, it would be much easier for them to gain a good reputation in a village. Since they were living close to the villagers would have known them more easily, more intimately, and therefore they could get to be very well known among that group quite quickly. However, the Buddha also noted that there were significant dangers and drawbacks to living in a village. In fact, these very advantages could themselves be drawbacks when looked at from a different direction. A couple of early suttas discuss a time when the Buddha went to visit a town called Ichanangala. And they mention how when the Buddha got there, he was in a compound with walls around it. And in the morning, when he awoke, or when he was beginning to get stirred, he noted that there was a great number of people outside the walls of the compound. They had come from the village in order to present him with favors and alms and gifts. And in so doing, the villagers outside the walls were making a great deal of noise. The Buddha, I believe, compared them to fishmongers at the side of a river hawking their fish. This is a description that the Buddha would give when he heard people making a big racket. And when he noted that, the Buddha said that he really hoped he did not become famous and popular, because in becoming famous and popular, he'd have to put up with this kind of noise and tumult and distraction. The Buddha himself says that he preferred, instead of this, the bliss of renunciation, the bliss of seclusion, the bliss of peace, the bliss of awakening, to the loud enjoyment of the company of others. I think many of us are with the villagers. Many of us prefer the loud companionship of our friends and neighbors, having a good time, laughing and telling stories. But for the Buddha, that was a kind of a distraction. And here once again, we have to remember that for the Buddha, the monastic life was really the life of the professional renunciant, the professional on the road to enlightenment, or the one who was already enlightened. The Buddha then goes on to compare the life of the monastic living in the village with the life of the monastic living out in the wilderness. The Buddha says that the monastic living in a village is going to have a tough time preserving deep states of meditative absorption. That is to say, even if they can achieve these states of deep meditation, they're not likely to be able to keep them for long, because there's going to always be distractions. There are going to be people around them making noise, there's going to be requests of them, one thing and another, and so they'll be constantly roused from their meditation and unable, therefore, to practice properly. On the other hand, the monastic that's off in the wilderness, even if they're not literally alone because they may have other monastic companions, is certainly going to be in a much quieter and more secluded place, one that is much better suited to deep states of meditation. Further, the Buddha goes on to say that a monastic living in a village receives robes, alms food, lodgings, and medicines and supplies for the sick. Enjoying possessions, honor, and popularity, they neglect retreat, and they neglect remote lodgings in the wilderness and the forest. That is, a town or village is a place of a lot of human activity, a lot of human interaction. And this kind of activity and interaction can, if we're not careful, lead to a sense of conceit, of a comparing mind, comparing ourselves to others in terms of what we have or don't have, in terms of our fame and our reputation, and how many people like us. And all of that may lead to us wanting more alms food, better alms food, wanting better garments, wanting better medicines, wanting to be better known, more famous, more well-respected than perhaps the monastic sitting next to us. It can lead to a lot of distractions, a lot of less skillful kinds of mind states because of our continual interaction with other people in the town. That is, it can lead to more striving for worldly ends, which are not appropriate for the monastic practitioner at the very least, even though they're perfectly fine for the layperson. The monastic living out in the forest, however, the Buddha says, fending off possessions, honor, and popularity, they don't neglect retreat, and they don't neglect remote lodgings in the wilderness and the forest. That is to say, in the wilderness and the forest, there are fewer people, so there's less opportunity for these kinds of more worldly concerns to arise with us. There's less opportunity for conceit, for the comparing mind to arise. Now, all of this isn't to say that there aren't drawbacks with a life of the wilderness. In another early sutta, the Buddha discusses how remote lodgings in the wilderness and the forest are challenging. It's hard to maintain seclusion and hard to find joy in it. Staying alone, the forests seem to rob the mind of a mendicant who isn't immersed in samadhi or in meditation. Now, this may seem to us kind of contradictory. In the first suttas that I cited, the Buddha was talking about how good the forests or the wilderness was for meditation. And in this sutta, he's saying that they're difficult. So what's the issue here? How do we reconcile this apparent contradiction? Well, I think it can be reconciled because what the Buddha is saying here is that we need to have some skill in meditation, at least a little bit established before we retreat into the forest. Because the forest, or the wilderness, involves us being alone a lot of the time. And if we're alone a lot of the time, that gives more possibility for our monkey mind, our hindrances to arise simply in the quiet that surrounds us. That is, for many people, living in seclusion is hard. It's hard because they don't have a mind that is very calmed yet, or at least calm enough to begin to appreciate the joys of meditation, of quiet sitting. So what the Buddha is saying is that for us to want to live in the forest and the wilderness and the countryside, if you like, we have to be, to an extent, already prepared that we're going to have to be a little bit more alone than we would be in the town. Again, not to say that we're going to be literally alone. Even in the Buddha's day, the monastics would not have, well, they would have been alone for some of the time, but often they would have had companions as well. The point simply is that we have to be prepared. The Buddha also talks about a time early on in his life, before he was enlightened, when he used to retreat into the forest at night to meditate. And he talks about how the fear and worry, we might even say the sort of terror, would arise in him because of the fear of being alone in the forest at night, which is, of course, the forest at night is full of creatures that we can't necessarily see, full of animals, full of some animals that might even want to kill us and eat us. So living in the forest, we're living closer to, nature in its raw form. I can recall, I think it was a couple of years ago now, when I was out working in our yard, and looked up, and there was a bear in the yard with me, walking over actually towards me. It was an adult bear. And fortunately, it was not after me in particular. It was simply wandering around looking for things to eat. I don't think I was one of them, but in any event, not being sure, I walked as quickly as I could to the side and got into the house. And the bear did not follow me. Some of you may know, if you've seen bears, that they don't really care about humans, in the sense that most animals, if they see a human, they'll run away. A bear will not. A bear does not run away. If you make a lot of noise, they might, but if you're just standing there, they really don't care, and they may even come over towards you. So, in order to really appreciate being alone in the forest, we have to be able to overcome some of our ordinary fear and trembling about being out alone in that kind of situation. Now, I haven't myself meditated at night in the forest alone, so that's something that would be new to me, but I can certainly see where the Buddha is coming from here. So what the Buddha is saying here is that if we're really, really dedicated to our practice, then the countryside, the forest, is going to be the ideal place for us. Now, I don't want to say that's true for everybody. Not all of us are equally dedicated to practice, but nevertheless, I think it's good to keep this in mind. And this viewpoint is, I think, most deeply expressed in the Buddha's description of the meditation on emptiness. Now, in early Buddhism, some of you may know, there is a profound and deep meditation on emptiness that the Buddha gives, a practice of this. And I've done a video on this in the past, but the basic idea is that one sits down in meditation and one begins to empty the mind of all of the various concepts, ideas, thoughts, concerns that fill it, in order to get a deeper insight into the nature of emptiness itself. And interestingly, the start of this meditation on emptiness reflects today's topic. The Buddha talks about the meditator who sits down and begins this meditation. The Buddha says that the meditator, ignoring the perception of the village and the perception of people, focuses on the oneness dependent on the perception of wilderness. So the meditation itself begins with the meditator essentially, at least in his mind or her mind, leaving the village and entering the forest. The forest, or the wilderness, is therefore seen as closer to emptiness than is the village. Now, why is that the case? The Buddha says that in the forest, here there is no stress or distress due to the perception of village or the perception of people. That is to say, in comparison to the forest, that our mental perceptions, our mental agitation in the village is more diffuse, it's more diverse, it's more scattered, it's less unified. If we're out in the village, there are a million things to look at. There are a million people to converse with, to compare ourselves to. There are opportunities to be gained in finances and lots of worldly things, in fame. We've already talked about a lot of that. And all of this distraction, all of this diversity is stressful. it's a form of distress in the Buddha's understanding. The word that's being used can be either understood as distress or as stress. It's this kind of distraction that keeps us on this wheel of samsara. But the point of meditation is to calm and unify the mind, and so therefore a place that is calmer, that is more unified, as the Buddha says is the case with the wilderness, is easier on the mind, less stressful than the life of the village. Now, some of you will know that, of course, the proficient meditator should be able to meditate anywhere, at least ideally, and indeed that proper mindfulness practice is one that we're supposed to bring into our ordinary life, all aspects of our ordinary life. So we're supposed to continue our mindfulness meditation, whether we're in the forest or in the village or walking or sleeping, or, well, sleeping is a little difficult, but going to sleep, sitting down, running, anything, we're supposed at least to be continually mindful. These are all ideals, and so many of us, let's say, find it easier to live up to this ideal in a place that's a little quieter. However, even saying that, we have to keep in mind that the Buddha himself preferred a life of quiet and solitude and did not appreciate loud noises and loud crowds making noise like fishmongers on the sides of a bank of a river hawking their wares. So I think we can see to an extent that the Buddha felt that the life of the forest, the life of the countryside, was more appropriate to practice than the life of the town, the village, or the city. Now, if you want to learn more about this emptiness practice that I mentioned, I have a video, indeed a couple of videos on that, and the one about practice I'll leave up here on the screen so you can see it if you haven't seen it, or take another look at it. Thanks so much to all of my patrons over on Patreon. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look over my Patreon page and seeing if you want to help support the channel. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next one, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.